We've talked human recessive disorders and how, the recessive phenotype, whatever it is, the albinoism, the sickle cell, the cystic fibrosis, is quite few in the population. Greater probabilities that there's people out there that are carriers of that recessive allele. And if they're carriers, that means that their progeny have, a probability of, you know, either being carriers themselves or to a lesser extent having that recessive disorder. We need to keep in mind that not all disorders, not all things in humans are going to be recessive. Some disorders are going to be dominant. Now, many of the dominant disorders are going to be lethal. Okay, um, the mutation in the gene, that allele, gives the instructions on how to make a protein that is an overactive enzyme, or an enzyme that won't shut off, that can't be controlled, or an enzyme that does absolutely the wrong thing for that pathway. Dominant lethal, a lot of times these are going to be lethal during fetal development. So there is no progeny to carry on that dominant allele. Sometimes, though, depending upon what that allele is, that dominant, disorder, there can be viable progeny, and well, all they have to be is heterozygous. They do not have to be homozygous, as we saw in the last lecture with the recessive disorders. Achondroplasia is a good example of this. Achondroplasia, or what is also known as dwarfism, a heterozygous person, big D, little d, big D being the allele for dwarfism. Big heterozygous means that they will have the phenotype of dwarfism, achondroplasia. If a person who is heterozygous mates with somebody who is homozygous recessive normal, it is a 50-50 chance that their offspring will be dwarf versus quote-unquote normal stature. If two people who are both heterozygous dwarf do mate, since they are heterozygous, that means that there is a small probability, a 1 in 4 chance, that their offspring could be quote-unquote normal. 3 to 1 chance that they will also be the dwarf phenotype. An example of this, what is the TLC? There was a TLC show, I don't know if it's still on or not. Little People, Big World. Two parents, both are dwarf, had a child who was normal size, quote-unquote normal stature. Genetically, it is there. It's just a 1 in 4 chance, 25% chance that each child has of being a dwarf, since they were both apparently heterozygous. Another is an example of this human dominant genetic disorders, is what is called Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is also, like I said, it's a dominant neurodegenerative disease. Neurodegenerative means that once these patients hit late 30s, early 40s, their central nervous system starts to degenerate, starts to break down. Their brain and the spinal column. They start to lose control, mental faculties, as well as control of their body. It's kind of scary when you think about it. This is a dominant degenerative disease. So you don't have to be homozygous, you can be heterozygous for this, and you are going to die from this disease. Look at the age, 35 to 40. By that time, most people have had children. Means before you even knew you had the disease, you've had children, and there's a chance that you've passed it on to them. We've now developed tests that we can go through, genetic tests where we can sample and we can find out, based on person's family history, did any grandparents suffer from degenerative diseases like this? You can test the parents, you can test yourself before you have kids. If you've already had kids, you can also test them, but there's no treatment, there's no cure. But it's one of those things, better to know than to be surprised later.